back to the live stream. This week we've got Robert Hockett. Robert's the author of Financing a Green New Deal. I've got two questions. What's a Green New Deal? And how do we finance it? Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to the live stream. It's September 23rd, 2023. We've got a very special guest. We're going to bring him on in a second. We've got all the guys here. We're going to be talking about a Green New Deal today. And how do we do that? How do we finance it? I'm going to bring on Daniel Sanderson first. Here he is.
Hey, guys. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Daniel's here. How you doing, Daniel?
Good, man. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. It's just a Saturday. So just for our viewers, I try to collect everybody about 20 minutes before the show so we can do any sound tests and whatnot. And all of you showed up with about 5 or 4 minutes to go.
Wait a minute. Okay, no, I got to tell the listeners what's going on here. So there's some gentle shaming going on right here.
Yeah.
Like, show up early, guys. What's the matter with you, right?
Yeah.
And, who does he bring on first? His buddy Dan.
Dan.
A little bit of shaming is good for a Saturday morning. Good for Saturday morning.
I wanted to set some high standards, bringing you on first with your hat.
Oh, what a low shot. Now the hat?
Yeah, and do you still have that that algorithm that makes your eyes move back and forth?
Yeah. Yes, I do. Right, let's see if I can get it to work. Is it working?
Let's do it.
Is it working?
Yeah. Well, are you just doing that on purpose?
I don't know. I'm trying to get the algorithm to snap it over, right? You'll notice if the eyes do that, there's nothing human. There, right there.
Yes.
Does it every time I blink, it moves it over.
Just for our audience members, Dan doesn't have a problem. He has a problem with technology and using it excessively. So if you do see his eyes move back and forth, that's the reason why. Hello to everybody in the chat. Botched Mandela, Tony Wilson, WWE fan 0104. That would be Josh from Canada. Here is Mike Radzicki.
Hey guys,
how you doing?
Oh, doing well. I was at my grandson's soccer game this morning, so I snuck in here just in time. They won, if anybody wonders. So yeah, we're doing well.
Right. So in soccer, I played fast pitch as a child. So fast pitch is the windmill pitching versus overhand pitching. And we had mercy rules. If you were 5 runs scored or more on you in an inning, you got to go up to bat. And then I think if you were 15 runs behind by the 6th inning, we just threw in the towel. Are there any rules like that in soccer for kids?
Well, they are quite lenient when they're little with offsides and stuff like that. But now my grandson's in 8th grade, so they're pretty tight with the rules. So yeah, it's pretty like standard soccer.
Cutthroat stuff going on. Let's see. Steve is having issues, so you know what? We're not going to get him to do the list before we bring on Robert. Who should we get to do the list? I think it's Mike's turn. Dan, you did it last week. I think it is Mike's turn.
I knew it would be me.
This is a pretty extensive list because we're getting pretty popular on the show. So here it is. Yeah. Top chatters, commenters from last week. Here we go.
Right. Okay, James or James squared, I guess. Per Kowalski, JBay088, Slick, Simulacrum, Wayne McMillan, Bob Liori, Cinemad, Political Economy 101, Alex Plant, Leighton Watkins, Cobb fan, Stephen Hilton, TR, WWE fan 0104, Botch Mandela, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Ghost on the Half Shell, Jens Runberg, Gooser 3000, Joe VNR, Master 1234395, Cheyenne, Tony Wilson, Dre Guy, that's one always throws me, Tom Roberts, Bill Sticker, Ralph G, Zan Casillo, Web Freaks, Bazyat, Jesus, Kim Burgess Driver, Sluggy Rex, the Minstrel 155, Ashish Barua, Tim Goldfish, and Andrew Sullivan. Couple botch, but
I think that was pretty good. That was better than the last 2 weeks by whoever.
I read them quicker, so
yeah, I think
don't overthink it. Just go with it.
Exactly. We're gonna bring on the man, Robert Hockett. Here he is. Robert, how you doing, buddy? Technical difficulties. I love it. Let's see what he types in the message. It's a mystery. He's typing. Okay. Audio just quit.
Can you throw up the list of talkers?
I can kind of hear you, Robert. Yeah, I can throw up the list.
Okay. So Mike, I want to help you out here, right?
Yeah.
I want to take the teacher and teach the teacher something. You may know this, but Slick Simulacrum. I was so surprised by your stumble on Simulacrum because Simulacrum is like an imitation paradigm. So Slick Simulacrum, like Simulacrum is from a academic Beauregard, I think. Anyways, it talks about places like like Disneyland as a replacement for reality.
Oh,
that's really what it is. And so
metaverse matrix kind of stuff.
Yeah, kind of. So this guy's got a real slick a slick side to that type of imagination.
Yeah, no, that's a new one on me. So all right, good. Yeah, I like the clever ones. Clever is good.
Yeah. Okay, take it down. I just wanted to do that because I thought it was a cool word.
It was slick.
Yeah.
Very slick. You know what? Robert's gonna log back on here. Mike, Green New Deal. What do you know about the definition of a Green New Deal? Seems like a very American term. Why do I think of FDR when I hear it? Tell me about it.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you my understanding of it. It comes, of course, from, you're right, the FDR's New Deal, which at the time, economically speaking, was a really new way of thinking about things, right? Prior to the Great Depression, prior to the New Deal, laissez-faire was the order of the day, so that the federal government, the national government, had a few responsibilities: basically defend the nation, sign treaties, provide some infrastructure, a legal system, a monetary system, and otherwise stay out of the economy, stay out of everybody's business. Maybe in time of war, there was a little wiggle room, but otherwise, and balance the budget. Again, unless in time of war or some big emergency. And the Great Depression really threw all that into question. We didn't have macroeconomics at that point in time. It was created because of the Great Depression. So it was let's do a full court press and use the resources of the federal government to address a lot of the problems during the Great Depression. So The Green New Deal is, I guess, something of the same idea. Let's muster our resources, probably at the national level. Pollution goes across state boundaries, for that matter, national boundaries and whatever. So you need the higher levels of government to intervene. Running a deficit to address these important problems is okay, like it was during the Great Depression. And I think modern monetary theory has given the green light to this, no pun intended, in that everybody's like, yes, of course, we want a pristine environment and whatever, as much as possible. But, at what cost? Are we going to, destroy the economy or, whatever? And the rethinking about how a fiat currency system operates and the advantages of being a sovereign nation with your own sovereign fiat currency and being able to keystroke it into existence rather than using a different currency that you don't control allows you much more fiscal space, allows you to do more things at the national level than you otherwise would under other thought processes about government financing of government programs. So I think, between the climate change issue and arising and getting on the public's consciousness, along with modern monetary theory, kind of getting on the public's consciousness as a way of financing things, I think let's do a full court press and as much as possible live environmentally sustainability, or at least bend the curve a little bit and get the ship righted, and we can do it.
Dan, what's your knowledge on a Green New Deal?
Well, I mean, in principle, I was really for the Green New Deal and the initiatives, especially increased government spending, as Mike has actually pointed out. I was very shocked with our live stream 24 when Richard Murphy came on the show. And he was a co-founder of the Green New Deal. And I think from that point, it was in the springtime, in April, that this show originally aired. And I don't know if I think it was partially in good humor or in benevolence, I guess, that he was referring to the Green New Deal. And he talked about the conditions that led to its visibility on the world stage. And it was really around, I think, some sort of a disaster, some sort of something happened and there was an opportunity. And his comment actually disturbed me because he said, there's no disaster. It's a disaster that you got to take advantage of. And so the opportunistic nature, I don't know if it was just kind of tongue in cheek or goading the audience or something like this, but this is a valid criticism of government control, that we're just looking for that right opportunity to snag a little bit more, basically government oversight, regulation, so on and so forth. So although I'm very sympathetic with Mike's point of view and the initiatives that may emerge out of the Green New Deal, and especially when you've got a blank check to fund things like modern monetary policy, it really would just explode the spending. Now, the assumption that Mike makes here is that it's all going to be spent correctly, right? Or it's all going to be done with some sort of responsibility or some sort of accountability. And so I would like to see that spending not go to the government, but go to the private sector.
How do we get it to the private sector?
Just a keystroke, guys. It's in your bank account. So
you're saying a universal basic income.
Actually, I'm not even saying any of that. I'm saying in principle because, I don't want to typecast that because it's like, how does the money go into the government? Like, how does it go into the government? Like, that's an irrelevant point. The point is that you got to get them the money. I don't want to label the program anything. I'm just saying that if we can create money, be careful how we funnel it up to the government for more and more control, because there's definitely bipartisan issues left and right of the aisle. It's a contentious issue. And I think that economy is built on colors of red and blue. Okay. It's conservatives and liberals. And I think that there's some assumptions in the movements towards climate mitigation that lean to the left, that just don't understand the mechanisms of the right, and that they're not evil, and that they're not, capitalism must die, right? This is the point. This is the bottleneck in the curve. This is the sticking point. So my position is one of consilience.
Mike, what do you got to say to that?
Yeah, so Dan makes some good points. So we don't want, by and large, the government, some bureaucrats somewhere picking winners and losers, right? You want them to provide funding to allow R&D to go forward for better batteries and solar panels and what have you. And so, letting the private sector do its thing is a good idea. On the other hand, there are things like better public transit, railroad systems and what have you, that are more of an infrastructure thing that could be, more in the wheelhouse of the public sector. And so, it's I don't think it's an all or nothing kind of thing. It has to be spread intelligently. And by the way, I also think that the end of the story with the whole modern monetary theory, its impact on macroeconomics and what have you, the ending has not yet been written. There's a lot of things that haven't really been tried that because what's the Achilles heel? If we're saying, the Green New Deal's programs, there may be some bad ideas in there, but by and large, yes, let's address environmental concerns. How do you fund it? Now we have a better understanding of how fiat currency systems work, so we have a way of funding it, but the Achilles heel is inflation, right? There are proposed techniques like employer of last resort programs, buffer stock programs that need to be implemented along with the idea that we can spend more freely on these programs so that we don't overdrive our headlights, right? And some of that stuff hasn't been implemented yet and is not well understood. So, we need more research. We need more public education. And lastly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, things like pollutants know no borders, not just state to state, province to province, but nation to nation. So a lot of the sorts of things that have to happen, it seems to me, require international cooperation. Not just signing treaties, but technology transfer. Developing nations, they need energy to develop. And if you're looking at, look, I can use fossil fuels and I can grow more food and feed my family and my village versus I got some solar panel thing that doesn't work at night. And when the wind doesn't blow, my wind, they're going to say, I'm going to go with the thing that works. It's cheap. It's, and yeah, I get it. We're discharging some greenhouse gases, but my concern is feeding my family today and my village today, not, 70 years from now, if we're going to raise the temperatures, 2 degrees Celsius or something. So that has to be addressed, I think, through international agreements, technology transfers and stuff like that.
We've got Robert back here. Robert, I kind of posed the question to both Dan and Mike. What is a Green New Deal? Since we've got your book, and I'm going to put it up here, Financing a Green New Deal. First, tell me what is a Green New Deal to you, and then we'll get into the financing part.
Yeah, sure. So we take both the green part and the New Deal part sort of equally seriously, you might say, right? So in many ways, you can sort of think of it as an attempt to do a kind of an updated version of the New Deal, but an updated version, of course, that is taking full account of the industries of tomorrow, which are going to be green friendly, right? I mean, it's almost by definition true to say that the newest technologies, the latest technologies, and certainly the technologies that are likely to be with us in the coming 20, 30, 40 years are almost by definition green themselves, right? We just don't burn shit anymore, or at least I think we've become sort of embarrassed about the fact that after however many hundreds of thousands of years as a species, we're still basically burning shit in order to get stuff done. And it seems like we should have gotten past that point a long, long time ago, but better late than never, as they say. So to sort of elaborate just a little bit further, and this is a little bit on my own take on things, that is, I don't think is out of sync with my compatriots with whom I designed the thing back in 2018, at least the current version. So one way to kind of view, I think, economic history in the so-called capitalist countries, or the so-called countries of the West, is as a kind of extended punctuated equilibrium, you might say. So we go through lengthy periods during which most investment and most consumption and production activity is essentially just sort of determined by individuals, people sort of pursuing their own little projects to make a quick buck or to make a slow buck, and then to consume this or consume that. And there's not really much role that the collectivity plays, at least not when it comes to sort of conceiving and pursuing big projects. But those are the sort of equilibrium periods, you might say, the kind of gradually evolving equilibrium periods. The punctuations typically are times, are the way I define or think of those, is as periods during which the collective acts together, where collective action is taken, and there's sort of a big national project or a big sort of group project that's undertaken, and that punctuates these equilibria. And things then change very quickly during those punctuation periods. Now, unfortunately, most of the punctuations only occur in times of or in response to times of war, but other kinds of existential crisis count as well, right? So the greatest sort of periods of punctuation in U.S. history, of course, were the American Revolution, and then the Civil War, then the First World War, then the Great Depression, and then, of course, the Second World War. But there are some periods that are just as serious or just as sort of fateful as times of war, precisely because they are times of sort of existential peril. And we seem to have entered into another such period now, in the sense that we are faced with existential crisis, in the sense that the entire species is imperiled. It might not even exist any longer down the road. So the time has come, in effect, for another punctuation. For whatever it's worth, I would like to have punctuation all the time. It seems to me we ought always to be collectively acting. But, leaving that to one side, there seems to be no question, even among people of a somewhat libertarian bent, perhaps, that the present time is a time during which some sort of collective action has to be taken in order to address a legitimate existential crisis. That's the New Deal part, of course, of the Green New Deal. The green part, of course, I've already sort of alluded to, and you guys have already been talking to, and that is that the nature of the existential crisis that we're faced with right now is climatic. It's about whether the globe is going to continue to be humanly inhabitable, or whether we're going to be sort of superseded by what I call the snow insects, in the same way that we sort of superseded the dinosaurs, right? So if we're to avoid the age of the snow insects, it seems to me, this is a time when we once again have to sort of grasp the nettle as a collective, as a species, but also as nation states that sort of jointly constitute the sort of global polity, such as it is. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here. The colleagues with whom I developed this back in 2018 are now part of, or they now constitute a little sort of, you might call it sort of a boutique think tank that I belong to. This is, of course, New Consensus. We used to be known as Brand New Congress, but we were essentially pushing the sort of AOC. We were actually looking for and recruiting AOC type candidates in 2017, 2018, and so forth. And then when the so-called squad actually got elected into Congress in 2018, the stage was set for us to sort of formalize the Green New Deal and then have it formally introduced into Congress. And so we wrote up the plan, the blueprint, and of course the congressional resolution late in 2018 and early in 2019. And then the rest, as I say, is history. The one thing I would add is somebody in the comments noted something I think was very insightful, and I think is exactly correct. And that is that the Building Back Better plans of President Biden are simply a very savvy rebranding of the Green New Deal. They're the same thing. It's just that they don't use the word green, maybe in order to sort of let the green part take care of itself, in the sense that, again, if you're building back better, what you're doing is you're rebuilding, and that means you're renovating, you're replacing old industries with new industries, or old modes of conducting industry with new modes. And again, those modes in general are almost by definition green already, because we're just not, we don't power ourselves with kerosene lamps anymore. We don't light fires in the backyard or have bonfires in order to do our cooking. So basically, if you're replacing the old with the new, you're sort of automatically, making it green. So building back better just is building back greener. They're sort of extensionally equivalent. And all that the Biden administration has done, and I think this is actually pretty savvy, is just let the green part sort of be sub rosa, since otherwise people are going to say, oh, you're going to take away our hamburgers and our airplanes and our milk, which of course happened at the beginning of 2019.
Dan, what are you hearing here? What's your comments on what Robert said?
I think it's, I'm going to push, it's just almost an epiphany I've had over the last little while. Please, Robert, if you could invite me to that think tank, that would be really great. I think I'm sharpening a libertarian perspective, and I think it's in response to the group that leans mostly left. And I think that, again, there was what Mike was saying when he responded to me, was that we still need these government organizations to be able to facilitate and to implement and policy. And yet we do live in a place where we can actually put dollars in individuals' bank accounts. Mm-hmm. And I think that broadline consensus is going to be absolutely necessary. You could watch an almost immediate shift by being able to put, instead of money going into more government organizations or more initiatives, or people view that as threatening. They view that as it's just plain threatening. They can't relate with it. There's a power shift, and so then the narrative that comes out of the right is that this is just another power grab.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the left represents change. I mean, how do you represent change? Mm-hmm. You can always go back after the fact and say, with that 2020 hindsight, see, you were wrong. And so what we're actually perpetuating in the left is a self-defeating cycle of, and that analogy that comes from the right of eating its own is actually kind of true, because it does somewhat eat its own. There's nothing that they can do that will show that they were right down the road. So, I think we need to really think about how this gets disseminated. And I know you like this idea of punctuated equilibriums or whatever, but it feels like ambulance chasing.
Just a message here from WWE fan Josh. He should be around soon, we hope. We all know how Steve is. He's probably eating. He's probably got some order in Thai food. He's in Hungary right now, so who knows? We'll get him here soon. Robert, to what Dan said, what do you got to reply?
Yeah, I think this is I sort of elaborate on this quite a bit in the book that you kindly mentioned. I think at any given time, right, there are certain things that can only be done collectively and other things that can only be done individually or by smaller groups, right? So for example, when we transitioned from using coal and wood to using petroleum at the turn of the last century, right, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, that didn't just happen automatically, or at least it wouldn't have happened as quickly as it did if it had just been left to sort of individual private ordering. There had to be particular incentives put in place collectively in order to encourage that transition and to speed it up. And of course, the way we did that was essentially the US Navy expanded by something like 5 or 6 times what it had been. And it just found it much more easy to operate by using petroleum as a fuel source than using coal. And then the other branches of the military as well sort of converted to petroleum. And so now, of course, it became profitable, right, for the private sector to actually produce at scale from the petroleum wells rather than simply relying on coal-powered ships or wood-powered steamships or what have you. And that's just one example of millions, right? There oftentimes what we have is one way to think about this is if you think in terms of sort of orthodox general equilibrium theory, the sort of Walrasian understanding of the economy that seems to have been incorporated into all contemporary orthodox models, there's a lot to be learned from these models in the sense that they sort of draw out a lot of the logical interrelationships between various factors. But one Achilles heel that they can suffer from, unless we interpret them correctly, is that they treat everything as happening sort of instantaneously. They sort of ignore lag times. They ignore frictions. They ignore the fact that it sometimes requires, sometimes you have to sort of get over a hump before something can then sort of operate in a steady state way. And in a sense, when we decide that we have to do something like that to get over a hump, that's the kind of punctuation that I'm referring to, right? So when it comes to green energy and green tech and the like, I don't think any Green New Dealer is suggesting that the federal government sort of open up factories and start building green machinery, or that the federal government be the principal sort of buyer and seller of green things. But the idea here is that in order to sort of speed up the transition, you can't simply sit back and let smaller groupings or just individuals do things, because it takes a long time for that evolution to occur. And if we don't have the luxury of that sort of time, just as we didn't have the luxury of waiting for the aircraft industry to catch up with aircraft needs when Pearl Harbor was bombed, then we have to act collectively to sort of jumpstart things. And then once things are jump-started, then you can kind of step back again. And that's effectively what I mean by this sort of punctuated equilibrium. So I think we're at a point now where, in effect, we've sort of experienced a kind of equivalent of Pearl Harbor, or, to be a little bit more historically accurate, we've experienced the equivalent of the Nazis overrunning France in only a few weeks when everybody thought that it would take them years, right? This story, one last anecdote here that I think is just profoundly illustrative. Nobody expected the Germans to overrun France in 1940 as quickly as they did. Everybody was expecting it would just be a replay of the First World War. They would go into trenches, and it would be a 5-year-long war of attrition, and Stalin would sit back and enjoy it, and then once they were all weakened, he could kind of take over Western Europe. That was what people were expecting. But when Germany overtook France in just a few weeks, everybody was flabbergasted. And a couple of days later, Roosevelt goes before the US Congress and he says, look, I need us to be able to produce literally 50,000 bombers per annum immediately. We have to sort of jump right up to that. We have to ramp up really quickly to that. This was at a time when the aircraft industry in the US produced literally 3,500 planes, right? So from 3,500 to 50,000 in a short period of time, everybody thought Roosevelt was drunk. They laughed that there's no way that can happen. But indeed, as it happened, within a year, we were producing 60,000 a year, and then 80, and then 90. And effectively, what we did was we decided, okay, this is one of those periods where we don't have the luxury of sort of waiting for the lag time to pass. We have to speed it up a bit. And I think those of us behind the Green New Deal and behind Build Back Better are effectively looking at the present period as a kind of counterpart to having just seen the Nazis overrun France in a few weeks instead of 5 years.
Nice. I really like you, Robert. You are a source of wealth. I think we got to give a little bit of pump up to some of the trolls here. Let's give them some airtime. The Green New Deal is a woke nonsense. Nothing more, nothing less. Well, thank you for your insightful comment. We accept all walks of life here. Steve Keen is here. Let's bring him on. Steve Keen.
Yeah, I'd call that a crawl of life. But anyway, hi guys. Sorry. Sorry to be. By the way, Robert, I think you should know that I now believe in gods. Okay. Okay. But you get it. The gods I believe in are the Greek gods. They're a bunch of malicious bastards who enjoy throwing ridiculous paradoxes at humanity and seeing how we fuck up. And they take gods in which way we're going to stuff things up.
Yeah.
So I think the Greeks had it right. Forget about this beneficent god. They're a bunch of pricks, and they're making us dance to their tune, and we're screwing up all the way, and they're laughing their asses off.
They're trolls.
Yeah. It's all entertainment.
We've got trolls on earth and trolls on the heaven as well.
Exactly.
Steve, we've been covering the Green New Deal. We've got Mike, we've got Daniel, and we've got Robert all chiming in. Tell me about the Green New Deal. What does it mean to you? And then we'll kind of just tie it in together with Robert's work.
Well, I think I've hearing Robert at the final bit there talking about the analogy with World War II, and I use that all the time. Okay, and I think it's extremely accurate. We have to gear up as rapidly as then, but we also need an event which wakes us up like it did then. And frankly, we haven't had it yet, and we won't have it until something like, we lose France. Only, I mean, France just gets wiped out by some incredible storm. Okay, holy shit, this is real. And even the trolls start to realize that this is the situation. So if you think about what actually motivated the change from Steve, you're describing banksters and plutocrats. I mean, maybe for the gods, possibly. Okay. What we didn't actually have the action on World War II until Dunkirk. So you had even the fall of France wasn't enough. The fall of Poland and so on. It was 250,000 British troops about to be slaughtered, and then they switched from Chamberlain, peace in our time, to Winston Churchill, we shall fight them on the beaches. And the people really did realize it was existential. If this didn't happen, for a start, they'd have to learn a foreign language, and the English don't like doing that.
No.
and secondly, they realized all the stuff about what's happening in the Jews and so on they didn't realize how real it was, but they realized that it was real. And so there was a general social agreement to tighten the consumer belt, ration, put all the focus in on armaments as rapidly as possible, and hence we turned it around. But this, I think, is a far greater challenge overall, because at least the Germans, they had to manage to get past the British to drop the bombs on London. That bombs are going to be dropping everywhere, and we're seeing that right now. And it really, there's no predicting what's going to be the event that becomes cataclysmic. My money is on a global famine. Something like that is needed to really wake people up. And then in that situation, finally we'll start agreeing to it, but at the same time, climate change will be wiping out our productive resources. So it's an enormous challenge, and we have to think about it like World War II, but we still haven't even reached the invasion of Poland stage and people's acceptance that this is actually happening.
Mike, chime in here, both what Robert was saying earlier and what Steve just said.
Well, it seems to me some of the solutions here require thoughtfulness about how to present the messages and the incentives and the subsidies to the population. To be honest with you, if you take scientists who have credentials, I'll just throw one out. It's not necessarily his forte. Was Freeman Dyson, not an idiot. And he says, I have concerns about the whole climate change story. And there are others who are more in that space, meteorology and whatever, and they're censored. A lot of people go, what are you trying to hide? Why can't these, it's a bad idea in my opinion. As soon as that red flags go up for people, like what's going on here? Yeah. The whole Klaus Schwab Great Reset thing. You're going to own nothing, but you're going to be happy, right? And we're going to get a digital currency. We're going to monitor your spending, and you'll have an ESG score. If we don't like your score, you're not going to be able to shop at certain stores. Or if you've bought too much meat or gasoline, we're going to cut you off till next month. Now, whether they're going to literally do that, people hear that, and that's not good. They bristle. They push back. They're like, this is something's going on here. I don't like it, As opposed to saying, look, why don't we get solar panels wherever possible on people's roofs, and the feds will pay for it. You don't have to pay for it, okay? Mm-hmm. And you're going to still own your roof. It's not going to be some company screwing you over or whatever, because, you don't have to. But if we think it's a good idea, here's why. And we'll make it financially affordable. Or I know a lot of people around where I live, around Worcester, Massachusetts, central Massachusetts, people say all the time, I take a train into Boston. Geez, then I don't have to worry about my car. Where do I park it? Paying parking fees, it gets broken into. But there's 3 trains a day. They're slow. They're dirty. The Wi-Fi is crappy. And I got, 2 choices to get there and 2 choices to get home, or I'm screwed. No, and I can't park anyway, even if my wife has to drop me off, because otherwise I can't. Well, as soon as you do that, nobody's going to take the frickin' train. If you fix that stuff, a lot of people say, yeah, take the train. It's cool. You just get off and you don't have to worry about where to park or whatever, So it's that kind of thing where you start incentivizing people without bludgeoning them or freaking them out that I think gets us in the right direction.
Ooh. It's still going to take time, though, and that's the trouble. I don't think we have time. So I would like to see just universal rollout of non-fossil fuel energy systems everywhere, government funding of them, and so on. But we're going to end up in rationing as well. I just think I simply can't see any way around that. And the thing is, all the conspiracy swats, some of whom are watching. Hello, whoever the last guy was. They are going to say, "Oh, this is exactly what we predicted." Okay. Now they think there's a conspiracy, and the thing that really drives me, Robert, I don't know how you feel about it. If you've met a fair few of these so-called elites, the Davos type of, my basic summary of them, they couldn't plan lunch.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And here these people think they're planning this huge global conspiracy that's going to end up in all these various situations. Now we will end up in those situations because they've completely fucked up, and we're doing what we can to stop the boat sinking. And then that will be interpreted as a clever plan. Oh my God!
Yeah, oftentimes when I hear what are meant to be aspersions like this, my first reaction is, "Why are you flattering them?" Right? I mean, you're in effect you're crediting them with too much competence or too much ability, right? Two other quick points in this connection, it seems to me. First of all, on the idea that some kind of a Fed-administered digital currency system or some other form of CBDC would involve surveillance. What sort of strikes me about those kinds of worries is that, do these people understand that JP Morgan Chase is doing precisely that right now? That basically all of these major banks are themselves monitoring your expenditures, which is why you get so many mysterious marketing so many mysterious adverts via email and on Instagram and so forth. It's because, of course, these banks collect all this information and then sell it. And for my part, I would really rather that the currency system or the payment system be administered by an authority that is subject to the Fourth Amendment and that can also be democratically replaced and that is also subject to all sorts of other restrictions on the sharing of personal data than I would, having Jamie Dimon as my sort of benevolent dictator or my benevolent overlord. So, so it seems to me the thing that I think a lot of people forget is that the economy is already immensely concentrated, and it's very largely run and administered by 4 or 5 massive financial institutions. Rudolph Hilferding's prophecy, in other words, has largely come true. And what strikes me about that is that means that the idea that our economy is somehow laissez-faire or somehow competitive and capitalistic is actually hopelessly out of date. It's a sort of an illusion that the banks are really happy for you to believe because it means you don't notice them. But my own feeling or at least my own impression for what it's worth, is that the only aspects of the economy that really do meet the old sort of competitive free market ideal anymore are the bodegas, basically, and the restaurants, right? But everything else is largely, run by finance capital, in effect. So the question is, do you want that to be democratized and accountable to the general public or not?
Funnily enough, actually, Robert, I've been doing some work on this area. Combination of reasons why, but when you take a look at the size of firms in every major industry, including the restaurants, what you find is the power law. Okay, there's a handful of very large corporations and masses of small ones, and the log of the size versus the log of the number, you get a straight line. The classic evolutionary outcome of an evolutionary process, which is what we have in capitalism. It's an evolutionary system, not an equilibrium one. So this is a bit of bragging here. It's very simple bragging, but I'm going to get away with it because it's my show, or ha ha ha.
And it's your models. You really pioneered models.
What I did was, if you know the neoclassical idea of cost rises, as you produce more output, you've got to pay a higher price to get it, based on diminishing marginal productivity. Every last survey that's been done has found that's a farce. They have constant marginal cost. So I just realized a couple of days ago, well, it should be easy to prove that you can't profit maximize by equating marginal. So I've done that. That's part of what I'm writing in a new book, and it's ridiculously simple. So because the differential of profit with respect to quantity is always positive, you sell as many bloody units as you can, and then you get an evolutionary process coming out of that. Big guys get more successful, smaller ones want to innovate and change. That's what we should have. But people believe this. Again, it's another fucking neoclassical myth that ties us up in knots because we believe that this is a democratic system. This is $1, one vote.
Just everybody in the chat, thanks for joining us. Make sure you hit that like button. We've got about 30 people on YouTube, 25 people on Twitter, and I'm not seeing enough likes. So make sure you hit that like button. We want to get it out to the masses. Everything helps with the algorithm. Robert, I kind of want to ask you, because this is important, is how did you meet Steve? How do you know Steve? What were your encounters? Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, my favorite, I think I first encountered Steve through his books in the later 1990s, and I thought, who is this guy? I mean, this is the guy people ought to be teaching and reading and listening to. And then, of course, the crash occurred in 2008, and that opened the door to all sorts of conferences on sort of heterodox approaches to money, heterodox approaches to macroeconomics and the like. And as a practitioner in that sort of realm myself, I got invited to some of these things somehow or another. And oftentimes Steve would be a featured speaker or a keynoter or just another participant. And I was just reporting this to you guys before Steve joined us. This is one of my favorite Steve stories, is when we finally first met in person. We had both been invited to this sort of high church elite sort of Harvard conference together. And Steve turns up in like a t-shirt or an undershirt or something and a pair of jeans. I think you had ridden it on a motorcycle or something, Steve. And of course, I walked in looking like this, need I say more? And so of course, we sort of gravitated toward each other. And I thought, wow, you really know that something has happened and that the world is being turned upside down when people who look and sound and talk and think like Steve and me are turning up not only at the same conferences, which is not that surprising, but at Harvard conferences of all places. But again, it was, to me, I was a little bit gaga at first. It was kind of like, I don't know, a fan of Taylor Swift's getting to meet Taylor Swift. I mean, suddenly I meet Steve in person, and I thought, holy crap! I mean, this guy is. Now I have the face to put to the, to attach to the books or to associate with the books. And he was even more fun, of course, live. I mean, I'm sure everybody who knows Steve's work has enjoyed the sort of the drollery of his mode of presentation in writing. But of course, as everybody who watches this program knows, in person, he's even more fun. Right? He's everything you expected and more.
I must say, by and large, at heterodox economics conferences, you don't tend to see a lot of Arbani and Brooks Brothers rolling through the door.
True. Yeah. You don't Harvard.
I mean, the thing is, though, Robert, it's great that the non-orthodox like you and me are getting some audiences, but the mainstream is still pumping out its garbage.
Oh yeah.
And like I've been to 3 leading heterodox people's funerals in recent years. A guy who wouldn't know, Peter Groenewegen, who was he was a weird personality in some ways, but he was a leading history of economic thought expert in Australia, and brilliant. He could quote not just chapter and verse of Marshall and Marx and Keynes, but he could tell you the page reference for each quote as well. But he was amazing. He died. Then Jeff Harcourt, you'd know Jeff Harcourt's name.
Yeah.
Okay. So I went to both their funerals, and then Vicky Chick died, and Vicky's funeral was the one I was away. But I went to a sort of wake for her and a celebration of her. And I thought, those are 3 people certainly 2 people who dedicated their lives to fighting this garbage. They're dead, and the garbage is still alive. And quite likely, we're going to die, and the garbage will still be pumped out. So it's amazing how persistent and capable of ignoring reality this lot are, and they have the height of calling themselves, rational.
I think Jeff Harcourt played Australian rules football into his 70s.
He was amazing. He
was a tough guy. He took no crap. Yeah. He was good. He was super.
Yeah.
There's, I think one of the things that sort of perpetuates maybe some of the power of orthodoxy, and this is one of the things I love most about Steve, because he goes right to the core of the problem, is there's this tendency to think that if you're sort of mathematically sophisticated, or if you're logically sophisticated and you're capable of model building and model interpreting, then of course you're going to be orthodox, right? Whereas if you're heterodox, then you must be sort of wishy-washy and if not enumerate. And people like Steve and of course Wynne Godley and others have sort of blown that myth away for decades now. And yet somehow or another, you sort of still hear the Larry Summerses and the junior Larry Summerses kind of talking as if they had a monopoly on rigor, right? And rigor is basically for them a kind of a euphemism just for power, I think, because better rigor, much greater rigor, indeed, it seems to me, is found on the heterodox side of the divide at this point.
I must, if I can chime in real quick, my experience when I started trying to convert heterodox economists into system dynamics modelers and saying you're doing the same thing, except heterodox economists are doing case studies. And they didn't, my point is they didn't think you could mathematize their stuff. So there was a lot of resistance even from the heterodox people because the use of simulation back then wasn't ubiquitous, not in economics anyway. And it took a while. You'd get a heterodox editor saying, what you're doing looks interesting, but I can't, and my referees can't even interpret what you're doing. We don't have anybody who, like you're doing engineering stuff or something. So it took a while to, for those folks to get comfortable with mathematical tools that weren't the straight traditional trained optimization stuff that you're taught in North America.
I found this, if I go right back to 1972 when I began I was 71, in fact, I began my student rebellion against mainstream economics. And I found the same thing. People say, oh, mathematics is the tool of the enemy. So they're not doing mathematics. And I finally coined a word for it, mythematics.
Right. 19th century physics, basically.
Yeah, it's shit. I mean, they make assumptions which are logically incorrect, logically contradictory assumptions. They, the old let's assume a can opener is quite true of most of their methodologies. They try to do which is impossible, build macro from micro, et cetera, et cetera. But the trouble is a large part of the heterodox have convinced themselves that mathematics is the enemy. And I'll mention my favorite person who's responsible for that. And I like this guy, Tony Lawson.
Oh, right.
Tony literally said that anybody who uses mathematics is a neoclassical.
Wow.
Well, Joan Robinson, Mrs. Robinson was against using mathematics in economics.
Was she? Okay.
Mrs. Robinson, yeah. She always would say, I never learned mathematics because I had to learn how to think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, mathematics.
Doing the enemy's work for them. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here we got a question here. I don't know what it means. Joe's always got really bizarre questions I never understand, probably because I'm stupid and he's extremely intelligent. Ty, please ask Steve, Mike, and Robert about the application to the crisis of Keynes, how to pay for the war. Let's start with Robert. Robert, what can you say on that question?
Yeah, this is totally straightforward, right? I mean, and indeed, the book that you kindly mentioned before, the Financing the Green New Deal, in effect is in the same sort of line of thought. It's not sort of directly inspired by how to pay for the war, but it's essentially aiming at the same kind of thing. The thing to recognize is, I think, basically two things, right? First is that the money supply is typically largely endogenous, right? It's not sort of constrained, and that spending of various kinds, of course, spends money into the economy, and credit extensions of various kinds, of course, put money into the economy. And so if you're going to expand production of one kind or another massively relative to what it had been before, there's, of course, the danger of inflationary pressures being generated. It's not guaranteed that they will. It just depends on how close to capacity we were before we got started. But if we were close to capacity before we got started, there's at least the possibility of inflationary outbreak. And that requires an impoundment of some monies in order to compensate for the infusions or the influxes of the other monies. And all that Keynes was saying is, look, what we have to do is engage in a kind of forced saving on the consumption side of the economy. So we'll take money out of consumer goods markets and put it into sort of savings accounts for the citizenry. And then they'll have this great big nest egg to spend from once the war ends, when all of the current inflationary war spending pressures come out. And the worry is, once again, a worry of recession or depression, a renewal basically of the 1920s or 30s, depending on whether you were in Britain or the US. And so Keynes, in effect, was the whole idea of how to pay for the war was essentially a kind of a forced smoothing, right? You would sort of defer certain kinds of spending now until a time later on when you would need it, It's a bit like the dream of Joseph in the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years. And then, that way you kind of avoid, or at least you minimize or tamp down inflationary pressures that might be generated by the massive public spending that had to be engaged in for the war by taking private stuff out. But then you're not just throwing it away, you're saving it up, and then people will be able to kind of have resort to those savings to basically fuel consumer expenditures again once the war is done. And the Roosevelt administration did something quite similar.
Like that, if you look at the sale of the war bonds, of course, the war bonds were marketed as they'll help us pay for the war.
Yeah.
Because the government was creating the money to finance the war, and the war bonds were taking money out of consumption.
Exactly.
And that meant rather than people buying silk stockings, we used the silk to make parachutes instead. So that's the real fun. And then at the end of the war, as you say, people have got these bonds, they're yielding a reasonable return. Mm-hmm. They can sell them if they want. And then rather than having the recession that was expected after the end of the Second World War, you had a short period of recession, a short period of inflation as well, and then the golden age of capitalism. Yeah. If you take a look at why that happened, a major factor behind it was unintentionally the war, as well as the Great Depression, wiped out the level of private debt. Yeah. So if you look at the level of private debt in 1929, it was about 140% of GDP from memory. When you make it comparable to today's stats, by the end of the Second World War, it was 45% of GDP.
Yeah.
And that you meant you no longer had financially constrained consumers. You didn't have all the debt hangover. It was all eliminated. Government debt was up there, but that was government money creation, as we all know. So that was a major reason. The war was paid for quite easily. And in this case, if we're going to fight climate change, as you know from the Green New Deal, it's got to be government money creation. There won't be any way the private sector creates money in that situation.
Exactly.
So we got a question here for Mike from Tony Wilson. I like it a lot. Hi, Mike. Rad. I'm an engineer and was once told simulation is like masturbation. If you do it too much of it, you will think it's real. Your thoughts, Mike?
Well, I had a department head once who kept telling me, I heard in graduate school that simulation isn't research. And I was always like, Bob, I don't know what you're telling me. I mean, I closed the door. I'm not teaching. I'm working on why is that not research? Here's how I would answer the question. Modeling, simulation modeling, any kind of modeling, but let's say simulation modeling of the sort that Steve and I do is quite modest in what we claim we can do and are doing. And that is, we're taking what we know, either directly or from speaking with experts, looking at numbers, reading documents, and we're making it formal. Because we don't have a real climate in our head. We don't have a real economy in our head. We don't have a real family in our head or whatever. We have mental representations of these complex systems, right? So we use modeling every day to make our decisions and muddle through the world. The question is, can we enhance our mental models by making them explicit and letting the machine mercilessly trace out what we know? And we're trying to give our best guesstimates of how things work, or talking to others who have a good knowledge, and then sort of making sort of a consensus mental model and its official mathematical logical representation, and then let's let the machine trace through the implications. And then it's obvious that if we do this, the following will happen. Let's try it on the model. Your model.
Actually, I remember having a fascinating.
And let's see what happens.
I remember the fascinating presentation at a History of Economic Thought conference I ran way back in Australia in 1998 or thereabouts. And one of the guests was a religious expert, economics and religion, but he's also a mathematician. And he had this wonderful argument that what you find in the classical school economists, Ricardo, Malthus in particular, also Marx to some extent, is verbal differential equations. Therefore this will follow. Yeah. So what he decided to do was actually take them and say, well, let's actually put this as a differential equation and see what the result is. And most of the time it reversed what the person saying it thought would happen. And I have to say, in terms of verbal logic, the only author I've ever read in economics who worked solely in verbal logic and didn't make a mistake the whole way through was Schumpeter in the theory of economic development. Everybody else, Marx, Keynes, of course, all the neoclassicals, made logically inconsistent extensions of their verbal logic.
Hmm. I mean, another thing I think worth noting here is, I mean, we sometimes get hung up on particular words and we forget that those words have synonyms that, of course,
Yeah.
bring to mind other connotations. And so I think a lot of these critics of simulations, that's essentially the same thing as criticizing logic, right? I mean, since the time of Euclid's Elements at the latest, we've been essentially deriving conclusions in theorem form from various postulates or various axioms, or various assumptions, right? And carrying out a logical sequence of consequence derivation just is doing logic. It's just also known as thinking, and simulating in the ways that you got to do it is simply thinking.
We can't have that here. That's too woke.
Yeah. You have to be woke to think. Yeah.
It is amazing, though, when you are working with somebody who knows a lot about some kind of complicated system, and they'll make a statement that to them is obvious. You say, now, wait a minute. What do you mean? Well, blah, blah, blah. I say, no. Precisely what do you mean? I have to write an equation that captures to your satisfaction what you're telling me. And you get a lot of awkward silence and hamina, because they don't necessarily think precisely about certain things. All humans, not any one individual. And then when you force them to say, I have to write an equation here. If come back tomorrow, think about it and tell me precisely what do you mean by that variable, that concept. It's really quite enlightening.
So everybody, make sure you hit that like button. Please do it. I didn't check on the amount of likes we had, but I suspect it's going to be underwhelming, and I want to cancel the show next week if we don't get enough likes. Dan, I've got a question for you. Have you been kind of listening to the story, the kind of unfolding diplomatic crisis between Canada and India?
Oh, dear.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
How about you, Robert? Have you heard anything about the diplomatic issue between Canada and India? How about you, Steve? Have you?
I've just seen the reports about being accused.
Oh, no. So you've heard it. And how about you, Mike?
No idea.
Okay, well, I tried my hardest to do a lead in for this news story, but we're going to do it anyway.
Can I say something?
I got to really work on my hosting skills. No, Dan, you've already.
Oh, it's good. It's a good one. It's a good one. It's a good one.
If you're going to railroad this, I'm going to take you off the stream.
No railroading it. This is the thing about Ty, is he's got a fuck it attitude, and it's really fun to watch, right? I don't know. It makes me smile. It's like, don't lose that, Ty, right? Like, he did, I think you went Robert, Steve, Mike, and then you're like, fuck it, right? And then over. Yeah, that's awesome. It's the style. You got to keep it, man.
So this is an interesting story. I know it ventures a little bit about outside of economics, but it does tie into the fact that the West is trying to court India right now. But with this story coming out with a Sikh leader killed about 10 kilometers away from where I live, it's kind of put a wrench in things, and it's a good geopolitical story. So I wanted to get everybody's opinion. We've got Dan in Canada, we've got Steve gallivanting around Europe, we've got Mike in Boston, or around somewhere around Boston, and then we got Robert. Where are you in the world?
I'm in New York. I divide my time between New York City and Ithaca. Cornell is located in Ithaca. So at this particular moment, I'm just outside of Ithaca. I've got this little cabin I've been putting together that's sort of off grid. So solar and battery is what's powering my contribution to this conversation. And the water comes from a well that I had dug on the little piece of land, and it's right next to a national forest. But so that's where I am half the week, and then the other half I'm over in New York City ever since about 2010 when I started moonlighting over at the New York Fed.
So good stuff. So you're environmentally friendly. So I want your political knowledge at this point. From an American perspective, what is the tone listening to the row between Canada and India, at the same time trying to foster a relationship with India to counterbalance China? Where do Americans sit
Well, I think the U.S. in particular, as you guys likely know, has been trying very hard to court India, sort of viewing India as a kind of counterweight to China. And there's been a sort of thread of that sort of thought about India in the U.S. for decades. Indeed, JFK, when he was president, was very close to Nehru, partly because he was thinking it would be a kind of a natural alliance, right? All of the sort of formerly British colonized places, including India, forming a kind of Anglosphere connected up with Europe. But the problem, well, the oddity about the relation ever since Kennedy died was that the Indians were sort of too close to the Soviets for many American, right-wing Americans' tastes, and so for a long time, the U.S. was sort of connected up more with Pakistan than India. But a big play is being made by Biden to sort of make nice with India and sort of cultivate some kind of close friendship. And for that reason, I think the Biden administration has been pretty quiet about the current row. Just today, I think that for the first time ever since this broke out earlier in the week, Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, apparently asked India sort of politely to be more transparent about what has happened. So who knows, maybe there's going to be another falling out with India. But the way I'm looking at it from here, it looks as though Canada or Trudeau is doing very much the kind of thing that the U.S. used to do quite regularly in connection with India. And then the real question for me as an American, I suppose, is the U.S. going to, kind of fall back into the old habits, or is it going to try to, kind of keep looking the other way here with what Modi's been doing in the way that it used to do, of course, with respect to the Pakistani leaders, and the way it continues to look the other way when it comes to certain sort of strong arm leaders of other countries where the old CIA people used to say in the 60s, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard, or he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Yeah.
The question is going to be, is Modi now going to be our quote unquote son of a bitch, or is the U.S. going to revert to form and stick with, theocratic sons of bitches who aren't Hindus?
I mean, the funny thing is Britain has set this up because they caused the huge divisions between the Muslims and the Hindus in the very first place.
Yeah.
Usual British approach: you support the minority, put them on top of the majority, and then therefore they're beholden to you. And bang, what do we get? First of all, the partitioning of India, so all the Muslims are getting kicked out into Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then the rise of Hindu nationalism. So the Brits have done it again.
Yes, God love them.
Daniel, your Canadian perspective, you live, 30 kilometers away from me. What's your perspective? We've got a big Sikh community here in the Lower Mainland. What are you thinking about it?
Well, it's probably not going to be the most elegant way into this answer, but I did like Steve's point earlier on in the show about the conspiracy mindset, right? Okay. And the conspiracy mindset is something like the ultra elite, and Steve mentioned a couple guys, I'm sure, like world elites, probably billionaires, right? Okay. And they couldn't plan their way for a cocktail party or something like that. They're just not that kind of people. But one thing that we have amongst just by nature is that we're opportunistic by nature. And if we think that opportunity is pointed towards something good, we just intuitively follow that. That's our compass, like the birds follow true north, right? So if there's something that's in our best interest, okay, either individually or collectively, we move in that sort of direction, right? That's where at least our, we're orientated towards. So when I think about this type of thing, I wonder if it was more of a in a conservative liberal framework. The liberals are in damn trouble in Canada here. They are in damn trouble. Now, just like the United States, Trudeau cannot be in for a third term, but I think the health of the Liberal Party into the next election is at stake. And so if I don't put that...
There's no term limits for prime ministers in Canada, Daniel. They can go... Really? They can go, yeah. Right now, so we have minority governments because we have, we are not like the States where we have two things, whatever you guys call yourselves, Republicans. And so, no, there's no term limits, but carry on, Dan. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think they're in trouble. I think Trudeau's in real trouble from being elected again. And so I'm not saying that's the only thing. I'm thinking that is something that is part of the situation, right? Okay, that can be either leveraged or not leveraged to make it public, like to publicly call out the prime minister in India. Okay, is that's a very specific action as a result of whatever. And here's the thing: it's a very serious thing, because if it is a challenge to the sovereignty of Canada, that's right. There was an execution on Canadian soil. That is a big deal. But I wonder, like in a different government, would it have just been not publicized and just dealt with?
Yeah, what was
I don't know.
What do you think with Poilievre?
So here's a little backstory, because I've tried to really kind of study the story and get the facts. What was happening is the Globe and Mail was going to publish a story, and they let the government know, the Trudeau government, that we're gonna put this out there. That forced a few hours later Trudeau to go on the floor of Parliament and declare what was going on. There's been back talks between diplomats in Canada and India for all through the summer on this issue. CSIS, our security agency up here, was in tune with the backstory of this killing right from the beginning. So we have two separate investigations here. We have the RCMP, which is the criminal investigation, and then an intelligence investigation. What also another part of it is during the G20 meeting, Trudeau and what's the Indian prime minister's name? Modi. They had a conversation. Apparently it wasn't a pleasant conversation, and so there was that split. And then he came back to Canada. Globe and Mail said, "Hey, we're going to put out this story." Trudeau was then forced to get in front of it. And a lot of people have said, well, this is a political game because he's in a minority government. An election is 18 months away or so. But the thing is Canada has been trying to court India to counterbalance China, which we have not had a good relationship with, probably even worse than the U.S. is Canada's relationship with China. So politically, I don't think Trudeau had a choice. I think the Globe and Mail story forced his hand. I don't think he wanted to go so public in that manner so quickly. But I think if you let a private news organization break such two democracies, one democracy allegedly killing a citizen of another democracy, that is huge. And if this was an American citizen, this would be a really, really, really big issue. So that's kind of the backstory of it.
I was wondering, Ty, that my thought at least was that it would have been savvier for Trudeau just to let the story come out and then respond to it, so that he wouldn't look to be the aggressor, so to speak, to Indian eyes, that he would be viewed as being forced to respond. And I thought, why was he getting ahead of it? Was it because he looks good in a turban? Or was it because he felt as though he would somehow look like he hadn't known or something? And do you think Poilievre would have responded differently? Might Poilievre have waited for the news story to come out first before reacting?
I think there is a political aspect to it right now. Trudeau's dealing with a minority government, so there is that factor that if he had let from their perspective, the liberal perspective, and the policymakers and decision makers, if we let this story come out, we look like we're weak. And right now, the liberal government is struggling with they don't have a plan. It's been 8 years of Trudeau. They're not on track anymore. There's no grand vision. And they didn't want this to be another story where, they didn't even have a plan to deal with, extrajudicial killings in our own country. If it was let's say a majority, a stronger government, I think Trudeau would have had the luxury to do, as you said, and respond to the news story because he would have been in a position of power. Do I think Poilievre would have handled it differently? If he had a minority government, I think he would have tried to jump in front of it as well. If he had a majority government, I agree. He probably could have responded to the news story with a power projection manner because he has a strong enough government to back that up.
Hey, Ty. Hey, Ty, I have to give you your compliment because the way you're explaining that is very logical. And so even the fear-based point that I was kind of staging there, the fact that you kind of like projected that in a very logical way, I actually wish that that's what political rhetoric was. I wish it was somebody explaining the logic, to say exactly what the motivations were. That's part of, I think we've reached a maturity as a connected society that we don't have to play behind a lot of these games. I think the elected officials can, and I hope that they can aspire to that type of communication, because the way Ty explained it, it really dismantled and put forward what Steve had said. When
Hold on, Dan, you're going to get big cheers. I know. When you compliment me, Dan, you're going to get cheers on this show.
Okay. No, it's good. You got to give credit where credit is due, right? Now, Steve, when you're saying you're reading Schumpeter, I think it was, and he was the only one that actually followed a logical sequence, right? Ty actually did that as well. And I think this is a virtue to cultivate, right? I mean, it's like, explain yourself well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's a virtue that's unfortunately very rare on this planet. And and that's what I think is so frustrating. People like myself and Robert and Mike as activists in this whole area for the length of time we have been. You just find yourself having people saying, but what about the fairies on the pin? How many angels can we fit? Oh, for Christ's sake, can you shut up? But they happen to have the Nobel Prizes. Yeah. So we find ourselves, that's what I find so frustrating, that they think, they personally think they're the hard-nosed experts. They think we're the wafflers. And we know that their foundations are waffle.
Yeah.
And so I'm going through this stuff at the moment with a book I'm writing for my center in Budapest, and reading the foundations of the neoclassical macroeconomic models, which goes back to Ramsey's growth model in 1928, and they have no idea of all the logical contradictions that are underneath what they think is a well-grounded microeconomic model. So it's just the frustration that we have a bunch of people who start from a set of premises which are false, jump over logical contradictions to avoid it, and then say we're the ones who are waffling.
Yeah, it's striking how many people are not simply wrong, but like 180 degrees wrong, so to speak. Right? I mean, that's always, I'm struck by how many orthodoxies are like that. They're not simply incorrect, but they're 180 degrees incorrect. They're exactly right.
But that's how I reacted when I saw bloody Bernanke get the Nobel Prize last year for his crap on money, which you can already quote several central banks saying he's wrong, and they give him the bloody Nobel Prize. And you think, there's just no reforming this lot. They're just they're going to continue. Yeah.
So my mentor, I've said this before on this live stream. My mentor Jay Forrester would always ask me, "Why, Mike, are you writing articles for economics journals?" He would say, "Economists, by and large, don't care about the economy. They care about publishing articles in economics journals for other economists." And he's absolutely right. I will recount one story. Years ago, I was teaching at a major university, and we had at that time a large faculty lounge with a couple of giant cauldrons full of coffee. So everybody would make their way there and fill up their coffee cup and whatever. And of course, you'd run into people there and how you doing? Nice, have a nice day stuff. And there was this little group of macroeconomists who would gather to the side by a blackboard. And they were working their way through Lucas and Stokely, which was the Bible of rational expectations modeling, kind of the standard textbook. And I asked them once, I went in for coffee and I stopped by, I said, "Why you guys," I said, "you can't possibly believe that people have rational expectations and whatever." And they're like, "No, we don't." They said, "But to get an article published in a good macro journal, you got to do this stuff." So we're working our way through it. They care about the economy. They've got articles and journals.
Yeah, if it doesn't make use of the separating hyperplane theory, it doesn't get published, right? Or theorem, I should say. Yeah.
I mean, look, I went to the American Economic Review conference, as it happens, the 50th year of the anniversary of John Muth's paper on rational expectations, and I've read that paper several times. And the point which I find most hilarious about it is his justification for saying information is scarce and the economy generally does not waste it and only goes from there. Well, if information is scarce, according to neoclassical theory, it would have to have a price.
Mm-hmm.
And as a rational consumer of information, you wouldn't pay for infinite information. You would pay for the point until the marginal utility of the information equaled the marginal cost of you acquiring it.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's rational to be irrational.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is one of these. They jump across a river, 300 meters wide with a single assumption, and then they think they're being sensible, and you can't bring them back to it because they build all their models in their spaces, and they don't even know their own foundations.
Mm-hmm.
I know where it's coming from.
Huh? Sorry?
I know where it's coming from.
Where's it coming from?
I think it's a Platonic origin. Plato and his infinite, and then we're talking is bigger than Plato. It's not just you go to philosophy class and you learn about Plato's forms and stuff like that. It's not that. It's the tradition that is the Western tradition. Now, specifically in the Republic, the idea of an ideal state is a projection of a noble person, a noble being, a person, right? And that's, I think, inherently the problem. The misconception is that we project what the individual is supposed to be at the aggregate, right? And that's maybe as best as ancient philosophy could have gotten it. I mean, basically, it's like our state should function like the ideal, noble, good leader, right? That's kind of the idea. And I hope that that's ammunition for you guys, rather than just scratching your heads and walking in circles and looking at your own belly buttons, which the philosophers actually get attacked for. What we're actually looking at is something that goes right back to Plato. And if you look at how Plato got things right, when it's introspective, okay, when the star of the show is Socrates and it's introspective, this is an amazingly accurate simulacrum, to use the word from earlier, of our psychology, evolutionary wise, right? But as soon as you extrapolate it into what the phenomenon that happens at the aggregate and pretend that it's somehow supposed to be the ideal person, right? It's fine to have that as an ideal, right, to come back to and talk about, but understand that it's a fairy tale. And what's the use of the fairy tale? That's what you need to look at, right? In my humble opinion.
It's also, Mike, you dive in, yeah.
Oh, I just, maybe I'll veer us a little bit off course, but I had a question for both Bob and Steve. Maybe whack the beehive with a stick a little bit. And circling back to the Green New Deal and climate change and all that. So one of my colleagues, Dennis Meadows, who was one of the authors of the Limits to Growth study, Forster student, whatever, used to say, if we change what we're doing, sort of redesign the system a little bit, we can avoid any overshoot and collapse behavior. But in recent years, he's changed his message and says, I don't think we can avoid it any longer. And I think that's kind of what Steve was alluding to before about famines and stuff. I'm not sure about Bob's position. But what Dennis counsels now is, instead of trying to avoid the collapse of the system, it's redesign things so that after the collapse, the system is resilient and will pop back to the surface as quickly as possible, rather than being crushed down and remaining down for an extended period of time. And I just thought I'd ask each of you what you thought about that perspective.
Do you want to take first crack?
Okay, I think we are definitely an overshoot. And my real worry is not avoiding the crunch, because I think it's going to happen. We can't say what it will be, but we're going to start getting devastating results, and they're going to accumulate and compound each other. But what you want to have is a capacity to have a functional society on the other side of that. And I'm incredibly pessimistic. I think there's only going to be a handful of countries that have a possibility of pulling it off, and I don't think America's one of them. But what I'd want to do is have as much capacity to have alternative energy sources at that time. In terms of the ship analogy and the plane analogy you gave earlier, Robert, I'd want to see now rolling out as many mirrors. The mirror campaign. I'd want to have factories using bottle waste to produce as many mirror, and we can then drop them out of bombers over the Arctic and try to reverse it. Have that capacity and build it up now, because if you don't have it, you won't be able to make it when the damage starts. So I really do think that has to be the focus. We are going to crash. We are going to have some devastating events. Large numbers of people will die. Much of our productive capability will be destroyed in the process. How the hell do we hold together a civilization on the other side of that? That's really the main concern I have now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think my concerns are sort of similar. I mean, I'm a kind of walking contradiction in one sense, in that I'm always kind of metabolically optimistic. So that even when I can't give you a reason to be optimistic, and even when I can give all manner of reason for why one ought to be pessimistic, I continue for some reason and somehow just to sort of feel this sense of optimism. And to some degree, that's still sort of driving me now. And it kind of leads me then to kind of keep my eye out for various things that might be done under various scenarios, right? Because there's such a great variety of contingencies that might end up coming to pass. But if I had to make a kind of a rough prediction, that sort of abstracted away from my attitudes or my general hopeful disposition or whatever, I would tend to think that the polities or the organizations that are probably going to prove most resilient when things kind of continue to go to hell in a handcart, or Hades in a handcart for a while, might actually be China, right? In the sense that there seems to be at least some continuing degree of social cohesiveness, even if that's partly a product of coercive mechanisms or coercive means. But it feels to me as though the sort of forces of atavism or entropy in the sort of Anglo-Saxon world and in the Western world more broadly are quite pronounced, such that I've gotten to the point where I feel like I don't even have an idea as to what might happen next. I have no idea what's going to happen in the 2024 elections in the U.S., for example. I have no idea what's going to happen with, Trump's prosecutions and whether people are going to break him out of jail, or whether it basically gets going to be, to use a nice Aussie example, a Mad Max kind of world throughout the West. But whereas with a place like a country like China, I feel as though one can at least to some degree predict where things might go with at least a reasonable degree of confidence. And that is basically to say, I don't think that Chinese society is as entropic as so much of the rest of the world seems to be right now. That's not to say that I'm therefore envious or that I want to go over and live in China so that I can survive or what have you, although maybe that would be a good idea. But it's just to say that I've never actually, maybe another way to put this would be to say that until about maybe 2015 or maybe even until 2010 or so, I felt as though you could more or less kind of see where things were going to go. And I didn't think it looked good. I thought things were going to go to a very bad place, but at least it seemed like it was more or less clear. But then so many unexpected things have happened since 2008, including the Occupy movement, including the sort of bestseller status of Piketty's more or less lame, but at least better than a lot of orthodoxy book. And then, of course, who would have guessed or who would have predicted that Bernie Sanders would have done as well as he did, and then that Donald Trump would do as well as he did. So that at this point, I'm almost at the stage where I hardly dare predict any longer what's going to happen outside of, say, China and maybe a few other places.
So could I, sorry to dominate here for a little bit, but I just wanted to follow up with both Bob and Steve. And Bob mentioned that he's living a little bit off grid and so forth in the Finger Lakes area there. Sounds wonderful. In a related topic, but a little more specific, what do you think about the vulnerability of the electric grid and a prolonged grid down situation and the havoc that could cause, both to Bob and Steve?
It feels to me like a sort of a race against time, right? I mean, there are moves being made in the direction of sort of resilience. There do seem to be moves being made fairly rapidly to ensure that you have kind of, I guess, multimodal energy sources so that you can kind of fall back on one if another one fails. But I don't know that the progress along those lines is moving as rapidly as is necessary. And I think it might even just be impossible to predict at this point. I mean, insofar as weather patterns continue to retain at least some degree of stochasticity, it might just be that we're sort of thrown back on sort of info gap decision procedure here, having to sort of figure out ways of, I don't know, somewhat rationally dealing with what is now looking increasingly like a case of radical uncertainty. But Steve, of course, has much more sophisticated models to work with than most of us, and so Steve might be a little bit more optimistic about.
I'm pessimistic, frankly, and I think COVID actually amplified that pessimism by seeing how badly our so-called elites handled it. I mean, Jesus, what a great conspiracy it was, you know. So that's why one country totally blocks down travel and another one opens it up completely. It's obviously a plan.
Clearly.
So fucking up completely on that challenge. And when we start seeing, like, what worries me is the possibility of a global famine, which would be, for example, let's say the wheat crop of Russia and Ukraine and Idaho all get wiped out at once, and then suddenly we've got two-thirds as much grain as we need for the entire population of the planet. And then we'll see what happens, like with India, as you know, has banned rice exports. And I've just been told recently they've actually also banned basmati. They were exporting basmati for, now they're banning basmati as well. So there's no rice coming out of India. And that I think we're going to see is nationalism for countries which can produce their own food. And I would actually recommend that, frankly, because you want to have some chance of survival. Well, I don't know. I haven't studied this in detail, but apparently China is not food self-sufficient. So that's otherwise I'd agree with you completely on China, because I mean, quite a few trips there. I've seen that. I was there back in 81, 82. I saw it, right on the transition from Mao and Madame Mao, and the dramatic improvement of people's lifestyles and how much the Chinese alive today have seen that in their own lifetime. So they've got an agreement with the nature of the society. They're willing to accept a large part of the restrictions and collective beliefs, attitudes, and even corruption as well in the Communist Party, so long as those improvements keep up. But if they can't produce the food, and that's that my choice of countries to think they're going to have some chance of survival, they have to be food self-sufficient, and not just self-sufficient, but dramatically excess. And the best country on that front, frankly, is the one I'm living in right now, the Netherlands.
Oh, right, yeah.
So this has gotten really dark. I've got we'll do that question after, but I gotta put Robert on the spot. Robert, we always get the guests to read the list for the top chatters and commenters, just because they drive this show. Really, we wouldn't have a show if people didn't watch. I didn't get the guest last week to read it. He's a lovely man, but a bit of a stick in the mud. So I avoided that. But I think, Robert, you're more than capable of reading the list. So here it is, top chatters and commenters from last week. Go ahead, Robert.
So what am I supposed to do here?
You read all of those
just
names.
Read them off? Oh, gotcha. Okay. James, Per Korowski, J-Bay 088, Slick Simulacrum, Wayne McMillan, Bob Leor, Cinemad, that's a great name, Political Economy 101, Alex Plante, Leighton Watkins, Cobb Fan, Stephen Hinton, TR, W. Wee Fan 0104, Botched Mandala, nice, Michael DeSouza Cruz, Ghost on the Half Shell, great name, Jens Rundberg, Gooser 3000, Jovian R, Master 1234395, Shaheen, Tony Wilson, Drageye, Tom Roberts, Bill Sticker, Ralph G, Jean Cassiel, Web Freaks, Bosniat, Jesus or Jesus, Kim Burgess Driver, Sluguse Rex, the Minstrel 55, Ashish Barua, Tim Goldfinch, and Andrew Sullivan. Yay!
That was really good.
Thank you.
He's got good first time reading skills, right? Like
I thought that was great, especially Master 1234395. I can't even do that. That was impressive. Good job.
Just not overthink it. Don't overthink it. Just read it.
I had that experience once at a graduation ceremony because I got stuck with having to read out the names.
Oh, right, yeah.
Kingston, London. And like it's a smorgasbord of nationalities there. And I just thought I'm just gonna look at the characters and try to pronounce them as they look like. And I did it, and I got the vice chancellor said he was in awe. I got all apparently got all the pronunciations right.
Excellent.
Wow,
You know, go with the flow. I could never do it twice. It's the one time I managed to nail it.
Yeah, and everything. Any other time, Steve, you can hide it under the derivative of your accent.
Being an Aussie does have its advantages. That's true.
Yes.
So I want to continue on the dark theme here. We've got political economy 101. Is population degrowth necessary for environmental justice? I'll start with Robert.
I really don't know, to tell you the truth, right? Because so much seems to ride on, so what we turn out to be able to do as we continue to sort of develop the technologies. So I don't know whether degrowth would be necessary, right? It seems to me that if we were to sort of, if we were suddenly to freeze in place the technologies that we have in the distributions of the uses of those technologies as we currently find them, then I would think that some form of degrowth would indeed be necessary. But because there's so much promise in the realm of discovery and in the realm of dedication or determination on the part of many people now to spread widely and rapidly the usability of new technologies that would be environmentally sustainable and even environmentally reclaiming, so that we could actually engage in real reclamation, it seems to me it's at least theoretically possible that we could bring about a sort of a much more environmentally just state of affairs on the planet without having to degrow.
Steve?
Well, that was the cheerful one. Now you've got me. I'm going to first of all go back theoretically to as Mike has mentioned, our mentors and Dennis Meadows and the limits to growth. And I think it was 7 system states in that model, wasn't it, Mike? One of which was population. And when they tried to get the model to stabilize, and by the way, for those who don't know, it was based on extremely well-detailed empirical data from 1900 to 1970. They got the 7 system states with an amazing amount of research of getting people together who are experts. I was looking for the copy of the book and I couldn't see it.
I think it's actually around 17 system states in World 3 and 5 in World 2.
Jay had
17.
I think 6 in World 2. Yeah, 6.
Yeah, it was too many in my opinion. Anyway, in none of this, they could not stabilize it without also stabilizing population. And they were talking of stabilizing population we had back in 1970, which is about, 1/3 what we have now. So even in terms of the limits to growth, at that time, before we put the extra pressure on the biosphere, they were imagining 3 billion people, and I frankly think that's optimistic now. I think we're more like there, and that's why I'm so scared about the future, because if we see mass famines, mass starvation, and simple inability to give people what they need to stay alive, then we're going to see political and enormous chaos there. So I do expect to see a huge drop in our populations. I'll take the question another way, and that would it be possible to do it in a gradual approach? I think maybe the answer would be yes, but that would mean immediate rationing of everything, including energy, so that we drastically reduce the load that the top 1 to 3% are putting on the planet, and then with that far more egalitarian distribution, and redirect ourselves toward basic inputs like food and energy. Maybe it could be done, but that involves a level of coordination, which would take a capacity to conspire that the jerks think they currently have, which of course we know they don't.
Yeah, I think our views can be reconciled actually, because I'm my own tendency is to start with what would seem to be theoretically possible, and then to ask, what would be required for that actually to be practicable, right? And I'm much more pessimistic about practicability. I mean, just to sort of add a little sense of perspective to my own sort of interventions thus far, I don't think at the present time that we're moving nearly rapidly enough in the direction of the kinds of progress that are going to be necessary in order to get there, right? In order to avoid the cataclysm that Steve envisages. I think we would have to accelerate our current efforts by orders of magnitude in order to avert, right? And I should definitely add that in, because even though I sort of tend to accentuate the positive by focusing on what seems to be theoretically possible, sort of in an RFK kind of way. I look at what could be and I ask why not. But if I'm being completely sober, the why not wouldn't be there wouldn't be a theoretical answer to the why not, but there would be a practical answer, which is that, again, as I think Steve put it beautifully, I mean, we do need coordination and we do need collective action. And that's precisely what seems to be becoming less and less possible as the forces of entropy sort of have their way, especially in the West.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So
beautiful.
we've got another question here from Bob Leor. First and foremost, he bumped me a little bit here, so I'm gonna give him the next question. When you speak good, right? You gotta share like that.
Good idea.
So he's got a valid question here. We're an hour and 40 minutes into this discussion about energy, the environment, Green New Deals, but there's no discussion about nuclear energy. Mike started off. Pressure's on.
Well, I think, yeah. So one of my PhD students has a master's in nuclear engineering from MIT. He talks all the time about how modern reactor design is nothing like the 1970s China syndrome, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and what have you. And that, that in some sense is the answer, right? Because it's not going to create all the greenhouse gases and so forth. There's no free lunch. There are at least currently with fission, you still have to deal with the waste, but there are techniques for that are fairly safe. So I think it's an overlooked area of like if everybody wants to go to electric cars, right? Well, okay, so you're not going to spew stuff out of your tailpipes. You're going to spew it out of smokestacks, your pollutants, right? So, but imagine if the infrastructure was there with recharging stations, so people weren't freaking out that after 100 miles their car runs out of electricity and they can't go anywhere. Like they could pull into a gas station. There's charging stations everywhere. There's rapid charging technologies, and there's nothing coming out of the smokestacks because it's nuclear generated. It seems to me that would be one, certainly not the only thing you would do, but people have to overcome their fear of that technology, and do an investigation into the latest reactor designs and what have you.
Robert?
Yeah, so I guess two quick thoughts. I mean, the first is that I literally, I have very, very little knowledge of the current state of the art where nuclear technology is concerned. And so it's very difficult for me to feel confident in making any kind of a normative claim one way or the other about whether it would be a good idea or not to sort of expand rapidly nuclear power generation. That's the first point. And the second point is that, at least from the point of view of what's possible, it does seem like that would be a very quick way of converting from, sort of fossil fuels. That would a way that has a great deal of promise when it comes to the sheer volume of power generation that's made possible. But again, because I don't know enough about how much safer or otherwise current modalities are relative to previous modalities, and because I still have no idea what's going to happen in the fusion realm, since we keep getting hopeful reports that end up not panning out, I just don't know what to decide, what to think from the point of view of, action guidance.
Okay, look, I'm lucky to have my supporters on Patreon, and quite a few are engineers, and I've got fairly evenly divided between pro renewables, which and anti, and pro nuclear and anti renewables. It really is quite a weird divide. And the nuclear, the type of technology which we have now, largely use water moderated, of course, extremely refined water moderated reactors, where in the old days they were moderated by graphite rods. And the potential was if the graphite wasn't there, then you could have a runaway process leading to a meltdown. With the water reactors, they're designed in such a way that if the reactor starts getting out of hand, the water drains out, and without the water there, you don't slow down the neutrons enough to enable fission to occur. So the fission process stops. So the runaway danger is not there anymore. Also, the waste complaints much, much smaller than, again, with the old system, with the amount of extra material which could be radiated and cause waste. And now there is talk of thorium reactors, which were the very first reactor was the thorium reactor. And a large reason for shutting it down was because it wasn't easy to make nuclear weapons out of it. And so we went the uranium way. Now people are talking about the thorium, where there's enormous reserves. And then the main hassle that I see with those things is the scale of the nuclear reactors, that they still use the old-fashioned way of using steam to cool to get the energy out and turn a turbine. Then you can have the situation France found that because of the drought, they couldn't, the water they were taking out, putting it back into the river, was going past the level they could actually use for cooling and damaging the ecology of the river. So they had to stop. So there are a range of promising technologies involving direct extraction of energy from the magnetic forces generated by the fission itself, and also some of the work in fusion is looking at the same idea. So the thing is, all these things are still hypothetical technologies. Okay, we have there are a large number of water moderated reactors around, but people are talking about small modular nuclear reactors. I don't know that there's one that's been made so far. Okay? So it isn't just a case of, build ships. We've got to actually develop the technology. We're still in the design period rather than the reproduction period. And that's what worries me about the thought of going instantly to nuclear.
Dan, your final thoughts on nuclear and the transition. Is it possible?
Well, I wanted to throw a question back to Robert about nuclear. And maybe you could summarize for listeners about your book, because I would assume that there'd be something in the book about that type of solution, but it's not necessarily, it's not the case. You don't claim any knowledge in that particular area. So maybe summarize for the audience and myself just what the thesis of the book is, and kind of where the readers will draw value from your book.
Yeah, sure. So first, when it comes to the particular technologies that are, sort of either implicitly referenced or explicitly referenced in the book, the sort of strategic choice here was to go with technologies that everybody agrees would be a good thing if they were possible and scalable rapidly enough. And that means basically the focus is on renewables. And that isn't meant to, sort of reflect any particular judgment about nuclear, or even any judgment about, carbon cap and trade or anything like that. I mean, the whole idea was that stuff that's already talked about and that there's already controversy about, we who were sort of pushing the Green New Deal didn't see any particular contribution that we could make to that long-standing debate. And so the focus here is first off on the particular technologies that there does seem to be a consensus around as at least desirable, if indeed possible, and scalable, right? And then second, the book then of course turns to, all right, well, what would be involved in that scaling? And among the things that would be involved would be, for one thing, a kind of making a mass public project of it as a kind of mobilization analogizable to the Second World War mobilization, as Steve and I have both tended to push. And then second, a look at the kinds of institutional changes that would actually facilitate or accelerate that kind of mobilization. And looking at the US case, at least, there's a particular kind of model that seems to have worked over and over and over again in the American case. This was the case both during the Civil War and during the First World, I shouldn't say both, it was the case during the Civil War, during the First World War, and during the Second World War. And basically it was to combine, on the one hand, a kind of cross-industrial and cross-regional sort of rough planning board on the one hand, with then a large financing institution that would be the complement of it on the other. So for example, in the First World War, which is the first time that we sort of socialized the American economy for a while, over 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson and Congress put in place or established what was called a War Industries Board, or WIB. And the idea was this was going to combine public officials and private sector officials, basically industrialists on the one hand, and then various government functionaries from various departments like the War Department and the Treasury Department and so forth on the other hand. And what they would do is sort of develop at least rough categories of needs that had to be met and that had to be scaled up quickly. So petroleum production, rubber production, tank production, textile production for soldiers' uniforms, leather goods production for their boots and so forth. And then they would establish sort of, I won't call them quotas, but at least sort of aspirational quantity stipulations, like what's needed here, what's needed there. And then to determine, okay, what's the capacity of the private sector to sort of channel finance in adequate scale to sort of do all of that producing. And insofar as there's any shortfall, there will be an additional public institution that was called essentially the War Finance Corporation, WFC. So the WFC worked together with the board. The beauty of the board structure is that it's at least somewhat democratically accountable on the one hand, and it's also representative of the diversity of the sheer number of industries that constituted the American economy and the diversity of regional capacities and needs, because it's a continent spanning country, just like Australia, just like China. And then also as between all of the different industries and between the public sector and the private sector. We then did the same thing when it came to the Second World War. We simply, instead of calling it the War Industries Board, we called it the War Production Board. And then we basically brought back the old War Finance Corporation, but we renamed it the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. And the same model was repeated. And the same thing had been anticipated during the Civil War. At that point, the Quartermaster General of President Lincoln was the sort of counterpart or the predecessor to the War Industries Board and so forth. And then the Treasury Department acted very much like a national financing institution and created, that was the origin of the dollar as a publicly issued currency and so forth. In any event, so I basically think, insofar as you can get greater expedition or speed in making something happen, if you're building on a model that's somewhat familiar, even if it's a multi-part model, then you might as well do that. Even if under other circumstances, if you were an ideal planner, you might just make one institution that does everything. And so basically I design a kind of counterpart to the War Production Board that I essentially call, I think I called it the National Reconstruction and Continuous Development Council, that includes essentially the leaders of all the federal agencies that have jurisdiction over some major sector of the economy or some major infrastructural part of the economy, right? And along with that, various sort of industrial folk who have some degree of experience in mass production of various sorts. And they become this particular planning board. And then I take there's actually a little proto-RFC still in existence within the Treasury Department. It's called the Federal Financing Bank, or the FFB. And I sort of upgrade and expand it. And the idea is it's supposed to sort of combine all manner of financing tool, from direct public subsidy to public lending to public borrowing to formation of consortia of private sector and public sector lenders. Any possible tool, any financing tool that seems well tailored to a particular production need, because there's a great variety of these different needs. That's all sort of laid out. And then in addition to that, and I think this gets back to the sort of how to pay for the war stuff, there's in addition something I call it sort of popularly, I call it the People's Portfolio, but essentially I call it the Price Stability Council. And it's essentially a kind of Fed associated entity that's meant to either to go short or go long in various financial instruments in order effectively to counteract price bubbles that might be occurring in some sectors, and counteract, of course, sort of price shortfalls or, debt deflations that might be incipient in other sectors, in order essentially to maintain a non-inflationary and non-deflationary credit money supply in every different sector where some such insufficient or overabundance of supply might be reasonably anticipated in light of the kinds of actions that have to be taken in order to sort of transition the economy as rapidly as possible to sustainability. But that's a short plane.
Steve, does that sound at all like an impregnated equilibrium in there, the last point that Robert was making? He'd mentioned
it's too dynamic. Forget equilibrium, it's too dynamic. You're trying to do it in a balanced sense.
Yes.
What you're trying to, you've got an economy with a particular structure, and you're trying to rapidly move it to a different structure, but to make sure you don't get any coordination failures in doing it. So
Exactly.
anything but equilibrium. It's and like a lot of this stuff was done using input-output analysis. This is where Leontief's logic came from. And of course, that's the thing that modern economists haven't got a fucking clue about.
Exactly.
Because they've got this ludicrous idea of, equilibrium through time. And they've got to see, if you wanted to get this done, forget the economics department. You need to drag in the mathematicians and the engineers to try to get this stuff designed if we're going to do it again.
I think the institutionalists call it indicative planning. Sounds to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And Galbraith had a huge role in all that stuff.
Oh yeah.
And actually, I got asked to do a review of Galbraith's new industrial state 60 years later. And as part of that, I made the comment that, I'd like to go back to the 60s, not just because the music was better, though of course it was, but because the vision of the future that Galbraith had then was where sensible, empirically based, experiential analysis of economics took over, and instead we're off with the bloody fairies. So we've gone backwards since the 60s, not forwards, as Galbraith thought we might do.
Is Jamie going to do a review of it as well?
Sorry?
Is Jamie Galbraith going to do a review as well, his son?
He actually wrote a very nice review of my review, but I don't know. I'm not sure. We should get Jamie on the show one day. That'd be great.
Yeah. It's funny. You look back. I mean, if you ever just sort of look back at what people were reading in the late 1940s and 1950s, sort of the intelligentsia, and the economists who hadn't been yet seduced by Arrow de Breu, general equilibrium theory, or what have you. I mean, the titles, linear programming, or operations research, or operations planning. I mean, all of this stuff, that was so popular at the time sort of suggests that there were a lot of people who were thinking in terms of sort of rational planning, which doesn't necessarily mean, blueprinting down to the tiniest detail, but it does mean providing at least a kind of a basic structure that helps set a direction in which then all of the private ordering gets ordered, right? But and I think part of the problem maybe in the contemporary time is we tend to think too almost in Manichaean terms, like it's either all one thing or it's all the other thing, right?
Yeah.
Even the bodegas are planned by state operatives, or even the automotive industry is just left completely to its own devices, right? But that's just never been the way that a functioning and successful economy has worked. It's always been a combination of essentially collective action or collective determination of basic contours, and hence directions being set, and then allowing all manner of private ordering within those contours. And it doesn't matter what you call that. I mean, some people will call it the mixed economy, some will call it socialism, some people will call it, mixed capitalism or state capitalism or what have you. In a way, it seems like it's almost worth forgetting. It's just developing a kind of intentional amnesia with respect to all of the old terminologies, and just develop a new sort of neutral sounding idiom having to do with basically what size of aggregate or what size of collective is most suited to sort of handling which functions, right? On the understanding that some functions require larger collectivities to act, and other things require smaller collectivities and even individuals to act.
You know what? I think am I wrong, guys? Is James like our biggest troll? I just, it's like everything I read, he really made me mad. This was about 6 months ago. He said that Steve and I say fuck too much and that we should stop.
Oh, that's fucking wrong.
Oh, fuck that.
Mike, your turn.
If I ever go, I'm going to
Mike.
call myself fuck instead of James.
We're going to bring Mike's mom on the show. She's going to set us all straight.
Well, we are at the top of the second hour. It has been great to have Robert with us.
Let's
bring up his
book
right here. His book is called Financing the Green New Deal, A Plan of Action and Renewal. that can be found on Amazon, right? That's where I get all my books, right? So I think most people.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and so forth, and you'll find a fun little assortment of blurbs on the back, including one from one of my old doctoral supervisors, Bob Schiller. Of course, he didn't have a Nobel yet when he was my supervisor. Otherwise, there's no way he would have been. But he blurbs it. It's kind of an interesting assortment of blurbers on the back. So I guess it sort of struck a somewhat I don't know, what should I call it? A sort of a small C Catholic note, a fair diversity of people who seem to find something worthwhile in it. So.
Nice.
Great stuff. So hopefully we haven't scared you over the 2 hours. You'll come back in about 6-7 months or so. We'll put you. Okay, perfect. We need to keep the really good guests that come along on the show. Sometimes we get shitty ones. I'll just put it out there. But you definitely are you are in a league of your own. So we'll get you back, and we'll keep talking about the Green New Deal. For Mike, Daniel, Professor Steve Keen, Robert Hockett, we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.